So welcome everybody to Tax Chats. My name is Scott Dyring. I am joined today by Jeff Hoops at UNC, and it's great to have you with us. If you have not joined a Tax Chats before, Jeff and I will chat, we'll discuss some issues, and I want to invite anyone who's participating at any time to feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. Or if you desire, you can also do that through the chat function. We'll try to monitor the chat and answer your questions. So originally, when I sent out the invitation for today's tax chat, I was going to talk about how Salesforce and other companies manage to report billions of dollars of income to shareholders, but maybe pay like no taxes. But in the meantime, the press has released what is being called the Pandora Papers, and it's making lots of waves in the business press for many reasons. But it sort of seemed like, given that the purpose of Tax Chats is to talk about whatever is most pressing in the tax world at any given point in time, Pandora Papers would be the right place to go. So Jeff and I thought maybe we should go there. So let me just maybe give a very brief overview of what's happening, and then we can start taking questions and hopefully giving you some insights. So the Pandora Papers is what I believe is the fourth significant leak of information related to what is often called offshore financing in the last maybe 4 or 5 years. First, we had, I believe, what was called the Panama Papers, and then we had the Paradise Papers, and then there was a thing called the Lux Leaks or the Luxembourg Leaks. The first two, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, were very similar to what we have in the Pandora Papers, except that the scope was limited. There weren't as many documents retrieved. In the case of the Panama Papers, it was limited to the documents from one law firm. And so this Pandora paper is like a larger release or leak of information. The Luxembourg
if you read all these press releases,
hang on, sorry, what?
I said, if you read all these press releases, they're billing this is like the biggest ever. There's
Yes.
never been a bigger leak. We're getting wetter than like has ever gotten wet before, because like this is it. It's almost like they want to one up all the other people. But yeah, this is the big one.
And at some level, I guess that's where Pandora probably comes from, right? Because, you know, Pandora's box is like the box that holds all of the world's like secrets and problems and evils. And here we have opened Pandora's box, the biggest ever, terabytes of data. And so it's bigger than the previous releases, and it's different from the Luxembourg leaks in that I think it's primarily capturing tax and financial dealings of individuals, not maybe large corporations. So you know, I guess that's kind of the background. Most of these documents, it appears, are sort of like PDFs that the law firms have, that people, I don't know if they hack in or if somebody inside the firms gives them to these reporters. But there's like 600 reporters from 100 and something countries and territories that are working on this. This is like a very extensive and far-reaching effort, right? Okay, so that's kind of the overview. Jeff, what else is important in just the overview?
I think that's mostly the overview. I do think like the strategy with this is pretty fascinating, right? So you have the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and they get all these data, this crazy amount of data. And then it's not like they just get it and they just go do their own thing. They themselves collude amongst each other. They've had it for a long time. They talk with all sorts of different tax experts, and somehow like they all kind of keep it a secret until like D-Day, when they like all release it upon the world. And it's like this big coordinated effort to try to make as big of a splash as possible. So I think it's pretty fascinating that like these law firms that are trying to be secret fail because somebody hacks into their system. But so far there have been no leaks about these stories coming out, and they've been able to like keep this a secret from the public so they can make the biggest waves possible. Because you do, I mean, the problem would be, right, if you have hundreds of reporters, if one reporter comes out first, that reporter like gets a lot more glory. They all have to come out all at the same time so that you can get another Pulitzer Prize to the ICIJ instead of like to one individual reporter.
Yeah, very interesting. And I think they're also very savvy. They've clearly spent some time searching for the prominent names, the leaders of countries, the famous politicians, the wealthy individuals that people know about. And then they have highlighted those names to kind of make a bigger splash in the media, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on with a lot of these situations. It seems like underlying much of what's happening in the Pandora Papers is the formation of shell companies. So shell companies are formed, they're used to maybe hide the income or assets of an individual, they're used to engage in transactions, and this helps keep the owners of the shell company anonymous. So shell companies have been around forever, and they're often used maybe for legitimate purposes. So you can imagine that under many circumstances, someone might want to be anonymous for a legitimate reason. So let's just imagine that Disney decided they wanted to build a new theme park here in the Triangle. And to do that, they need to buy a lot of land. If Disney Incorporated starts shopping around for land, my suspicion is the price of land would go way up because people know Disney has a lot of money. But if Disney forms a shell company where it's not so clear who is behind that company and start shopping for land, it might be possible for Disney to get like the fair market price on that land. Or another example might be if someone has a decent amount of income or wealth and it's known, they might be more likely to be subjected to frivolous lawsuits because they have a lot of money. But if you can somehow hide that, maybe that prevents frivolous lawsuits from taking place.
I would add a real example to that. I mean, one of the people highlighted in the Pandora Papers is the King of Jordan. And like it's basically come to light, he has all these mansions like overlooking every coast in the world, basically. Jordan's not a rich country. He's the king, but the king of like kind of a poor country that receives all this aid from the US. So why does he have all these mansions? Well, if you know, in his defense, he basically says, like, look, if I would have bought all these mansions as a king, people would have charged me more, A. B, the US gives me all this aid because I provide like peace and security in the Middle East. And some people don't like that. If they know where all my mansions are, terrorists are going to come blow them up. So like there are legitimate, according to him, those are his legitimate reasons for wanting to do this all through shell corporations. So that would be like a real example, like not wanting to get blown up, wanting to like protect yourself from being taken advantage of as a ruling monarch.
Yes, correct. Kevin Standridge points out on the chat that I believe Disney did in fact purchase land with these sort of shell companies. I didn't make that example up entirely. It was based in truth. I'm not going to vouch for all of my facts, but yeah, I do think that actually happened. Obviously not in North Carolina. So there are some legitimate reasons, but then there are some nefarious outcomes that can also arise when shell companies are used. So once one can hide their wealth or their income, they can also use that ability to hide to keep their wealth and income out of the view of taxing authorities or regulators or other parties that might have a legitimate interest in understanding what's happening with their finances. So maybe hiding from, say, shareholders or hiding from banks or lenders, something like that. And that's where I think there's a lot of negative press happening here. So if you read through many of the articles that have been written, it will say something like billions of dollars are being hidden, and those billions of dollars should be used to help these countries provide healthcare for their citizens or provide roads or parks or whatever. And the implication is that the hidden wealth or the hidden income is being stolen from the government because you're not paying taxes that should otherwise have been paid. What do you think about that, Jeff? Is that?
So in some cases, that's true, right? If I'm a corrupt leader and I'm siphoning off funds and hiding it elsewhere, which has been this has happened and this kind of thing is being revealed, then yeah, I stole the money, taxes aren't getting paid on it, and that's really bad. Alternatively, a couple more very concrete reasons you might want to hide assets. If you are some very rich person and you really hate your wife and you're planning on getting a divorce, you start sending money over to one of these shell corporations. And in the divorce proceedings, you're going to be able to basically commit fraud so that your spouse cannot see the extent of your holdings, and you're going to get a better settlement by having concealed these assets. So as long as—
Now, hold on just a minute. You said that was a legitimate reason.
No, I didn't say a legitimate reason. I said that's a reason that you can take after-tax income, put it in some island nation, and maybe it's just like held in basically a non income producing asset. You're not evading taxes, you're evading your spouse.
Yes.
I mean, there's plenty of other illegal, nefarious purposes like that, or you want to commit insurance fraud, you want to commit bankruptcy fraud. Like there's all sorts of reasons people want to know how much that you owe so they can like have some of it. You want to hide some of that. Only one of those reasons is taxes. But then also there are plenty of there are legitimate reasons for doing this, but they're not nearly as exciting as the illegitimate reasons.
The illegitimate reasons seem to be much more fun if we want to talk about it, or write newspaper articles. So there's a lot of talk about South Dakota. The South or North? South Dakota, I think.
South Dakota.
South Dakota is a big player here. Why South Dakota? What do you know about South Dakota? Anything?
So, usually when you think of like offshore finance, literally offshore, you think of like offshore, you go into the Cayman Islands or to one of these island nations that are super secretive. All you really need is a jurisdiction with enough sovereignty to create laws that make things not transparent. For example, another thing would allow, for example, for you to have a trust, so to set up an entity that can like exist forever. So if you, it used to be like these types of entities, trusts, they had to like die at some time. And that's not very good if you want to like keep wealth in a family forever. And if you're South Dakota, you basically say like, look, we're going to change the rules for trusts so that we can create this entity, have these assets that will exist forever. And so the income from those can just keep on going to people from that family forever. So you create a set of rules as a sovereign jurisdiction that make it favorable to put income in these types of jurisdictions. So any jurisdiction, including the US state, can do this.
If you're South Dakota, you're interested in doing this because there's really not a whole lot else going on in South Dakota. So if you can attract some investment or create some kind of a legal industry or a banking industry around your kind of new, more generous rules, that could be an advantage.
That would be exactly what big trust fund lobbying groups would tell you, Scott, why it's great for South Dakota to have this. I mean, there's some ambiguity, right? So it's not clear how many extra lawyers or extra accountants exist in South Dakota for these types of rules. It might be basically none, and it might be that the politicians in South Dakota are just naive enough to believe the lobbying industries that tell them to create these rules, and they create them, and there's no benefit to South Dakota whatsoever. There might be benefits, though.
But that's possible. But I do think if you look at some like countries, for example, say Cayman Islands, their banking sector and finance sector, insurance sector and legal sector is almost certainly far larger than it otherwise would be without the kind of quote unquote offshore world.
I think that's kind of on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. Certainly in the Cayman Islands, like there's a lot of lawyers there and there's a lot of accountants there that wouldn't be there otherwise. There's a lot of fees or companies paying these registration fees that wouldn't be paying otherwise. Alternatively, like another tax haven for slightly different purposes is Liberia. I was once talking with the CFO of a company incorporated in Liberia, asked him if he'd ever been to Liberia or if anybody from his corporation had ever been to Liberia. He basically said like, why would we ever go to Liberia or have anything whatsoever to do physically with the country of Liberia? So it really depends on the specifics of the situation. There's not like one size fits all for these things. Now, there is a paper actually, super fascinating paper by Joel Slemrod. The name of the paper is something like, "Why is Elvis Presley on the Burkina Faso postage stamp?" And it basically says like the countries that become tax havens are small island nations, not a lot else going on. So that the kind of summary of that paper would be exactly what you're saying, and that these companies economically, it's worthwhile to bring your corporate tax rate down, get the registration fees. But there's a lot more to the story than just that, and it's kind of
Yeah,
country by country, jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis.
Well, it's true, and I think a lot of people don't realize, they think of these anonymous shell companies as only happening in sort of unusual, exotic locations like Cayman Islands or Bermuda or something.
I mean, South Dakota's pretty exotic. If you've ever
pretty
been
exotic,
there, it's pretty luxurious. I highly recommend South
Dakota. South Dakota, by the way, is not the only U.S. state that you can form an anonymous business entity in. You could also do this in Nevada. You could do it in New Mexico. You could do it in Delaware. There are several other places where you could do this. And part of the reason might be, who else would form a business in Wyoming? Like, there's really nothing in Wyoming, or there's nothing in New Mexico.
Wyoming's amazing, Scott.
Well,
you haven't been to Wyoming. If you
I've been there, as you know. My wife grew up there. I go there often.
Literally from Wyoming, and is dissing on Wyoming.
Small little corner of the state, which is amazing. But if you love sagebrush and antelope, then Wyoming is the place for you. Now, by the way, one of our listeners has written in and said, in some countries, like, for example, South America, if your assets are known, people know how much you have, you then become very quickly a target of kidnapping, other forms of extortion, and so forth. So you may use these not because you're trying to do anything illegal, you're just trying to save yourself from dangerous situations, which I think is kind of very interesting to think about as well.
So that,
yeah, go ahead.
So that's actually, interesting. It's not just South America. So the United States, a long, long time ago, basically had an income tax system for a little tiny bit, where the income tax payments of every individual were public. Like, you knew everything about everybody. And that got shut down because of a high profile kidnapping case. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, they basically said his child got kidnapped, and he said, look, they knew that I was super rich because these tax things, or that might be the case. And it was because of these same concerns that was shut down the large amount of transparency we had about 100 years ago. Whether that was really true, or whether that was just an excuse for rich people to be able to hide from everybody else, I'm not sure. But that was not just in South America, where kidnapping has been a reason for non-transparency.
Yeah, so speaking of transparency, and that kind of reminds me, there are some countries where you can look up the amount of tax that any other citizen pays, I think in some Scandinavian countries. And so if I want to know how much income Jeff reported to the IRS, I could look it up. And but I think in some situations, if I look up Jeff's income, Jeff can see that I looked up Jeff's income. And that might be a deterrent too, because I don't want Jeff to know that I'm spying on him. I just want to spy on him. So if I can be anonymous and look up Jeff's income, that's fine. But if I have to tell everybody that I'm spying on Jeff, maybe not so much. So there's kind of interesting transparency variation around the world related to taxes in that way. And yeah, go ahead.
I do think, getting a little bit back to the Pandora Papers, I think that's one issue we haven't really talked about at all, actually, about whether or not we think this type of leak should happen or should be allowed, like how we feel about this. And I think it's a pretty
you mean from a morality point of view,
like a journalistic ethics point of view. And with all of these leaks, when ProPublica went forward, it was a different kind of leak, but ProPublica came forward with the Pandora. There's a accompanying article that says here's why we released this. Because almost certainly, this data was gathered through a series of felonies and through a series of breaches of contract, and that's something you need to think very seriously about. I think it's fascinating. I mean, both Scott and I are accountants, and within the accountant's creed is privacy is a super important value. When a few months ago there was another related leak by ProPublica, and I was talking to a reporter at a pretty high up newspaper, and I said, how could journalists let this happen? Do they have any sense for privacy or anything? And apparently journalists are exactly the opposite of accountants. And he basically said, look, if I get data that's going to inform some public debate like this, I have a moral obligation to release this data. And I said, even if it was obtained through felonies, yes. And they're basically very different views on the right to privacy that individual citizens have. I don't have an answer, but you need to think about that.
Yeah, it is interesting to think, because we read in the newspaper and we think, oh, this is so scandalous that these people have these shell companies, but we don't think about how scandalous it might be that somebody broke into a law firm and stole all their information, or worked for the IRS and released tax returns, which by law are private, or whatever it might happen to be.
And right now, I mean, this is fine. We want to like embarrass the king of Jordan or Vladimir Putin or whoever else is in these leaks. But it would not be hard at all for somebody, you have a Republican and you have a Democrat, just to let go in and just down one side of the political aisle, get all those tax returns and information about them that would be embarrassing, and release all that. It would be a different.
So if I went to ProPublica, do you think that they have your tax returns?
My understanding is they only have, they have the very richest Americans, whether that's me or not.
Okay.
I have the right to privacy. I mean, it's like the
Well,
top
it would be
400 or
fun to
500
know
or
if you're
something
there
like that.
then, because you might have a whole lot of wealth that I don't know about, Jeff. I would think that would be very fun to learn.
Big tax museum wealth. Our missions are steep.
Right there.
So we have another question here.
Very interesting to sort of think about that. So why haven't like regulators shut this down? I mean, clearly this sort of thing has been happening for a long time. We've known about it for a long time. We knew about it way before, like, even the Panama Papers were released like 8 years ago. It's known that people use shell companies. I mean, Delaware advertises that you can do this. A long time ago, I wrote a study about Delaware, and we found this really fascinating exchange where the United States listed the Cayman Islands as a tax haven. The government of the United States listed Cayman Islands as a tax haven, and that was because, in part, there were like 19,000 businesses registered at a single address in the Cayman Islands. And in response, the Cayman Islands wrote an official letter back to the United States and said, well, we're not so bad. There's 250,000 businesses registered at a single address in Delaware. So maybe you should practice what you preach. And so if we all have known about anonymous corporations and shell companies forever and ever, why haven't we shut them down? What do you think?
I think that's a great question. I mean, if you look at, we've been talking about these things for a long time, time spanning both when a Democrat controlled the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and a Republican controlled the presidency, House, and Senate. So if one party wanted to shut this down, I mean, this is a little bit naive politically, but it seems like if there really was this political will, it could have happened. It's basically my belief that the powers that want these things to exist are incredibly powerful with both political parties and all across the world. And that's why they haven't been shut down. Another reason is a lot of these transactions are allowed is because they do have some legitimate purposes. And so if you shut them down, you're also going to disallow those legitimate purposes.
So I mean, you're saying the Obama administration at one point, the Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. Nothing changed.
Well, I mean, and their response could be, they didn't have 60 seats in the Senate, so they couldn't do anything that they wanted. Yeah. And then that would be that's why I suggest it's like a naive view. But I think that there are very powerful lobbies that favor this.
Yeah. So another question that's come in on the chat, which is, do you think that we learned anything new from Pandora Papers relative to, say, the Panama Papers? Or did we just discover the names of more people who were doing the same old, same old?
I think so far from what I have read, I haven't learned all that much that is new. I mean, I think the problem is the things that there are to be learned don't appeal to a broad set of readers. So if you're the Washington Post, you want to write an article, and it's super exciting to write that Vladimir Putin has an illegitimate daughter in Monaco, living in luxury. It's not that exciting to suggest this set of wealthy individuals has this series of transactions that they conduct that there's no revenue rulings on, that IRS has never opined on. It might be illegal, it might not be illegal, but the IRS needs to decide because a whole lot of taxes are being avoided. It's my understanding, having talked to some people with some inside information in some of these leaks, that some of those types of transactions are revealed that they didn't know about, a very knowledgeable tax person, that should have been addressed because of these leaks. But I don't think we're going to see that kind of stuff in the media, just because the nuances of these complicated financial transactions have absolutely no interest, no broad appeal.
Yeah. So one of our participants today has sort of correctly pointed out there have been some legislative initiatives taken. For example, there's a thing called FACTA, F-A-C-T-A, which was passed, I believe, in the Obama administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And FACTA was basically an information sharing agreement or requirement that the US passed and sort of imposed on the banking regimes of foreign countries. And there is some research that suggests that banking regulation and information sharing has, at least to some extent, reduced the ability of US citizens to hide their income and wealth overseas. But you know, what's sort of fascinating, and Jeff, you and I were talking about this before we kicked off this morning, there's not that many US citizens that are being named as the guilty parties or the, you know, scandalous perpetrators in the Pandora Papers. And same was true with the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers.
I mean, we read these things and think it's just like rich people are evil, but it's mostly rich Russians and Europeans and South Americans, and maybe it's that they're, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but yeah, it's mostly not Americans.
Yeah, maybe the rich Americans aren't as nervous about getting kidnapped. I don't know.
So it could be that they just engage in less than few of these transactions. It could be, you know, these all stem from some law firm or some accounting firm, you know, somebody sucking the information out of those. It could be that the data protection at law firms that wealthy Americans use to evade taxes are just better with their data privacy. And so it just hasn't been the right law firms that have been hacked. It might be that Americans engage in just like fundamentally different types of tax behavior. It might be that, you know, if you're the Washington Post and you're covering this issue, that like there's wealthy people that you're beholden to that you don't want to reveal anything about. There's a super
it could be, Jeff,
conspiracy-laden theory.
If you're Jeff Bezos, you don't need to hide your income in a tax haven because it's all tied up in capital gains that you don't have to realize and is not taxed anyway. And everybody knows it's there and the law doesn't allow it to be taxed, so you don't need to hide it. So that's a possibility.
I mean, I do think the very, very wealthiest Americans, it's not like the very, very, very wealthiest, it's not any secret how they got rich or how much they have, because they were founders of just these crazy successful public firms. They have hundreds of, well, like a few of them have like 100 billions in unrealized gains. And there's not anything they really need to hide. As long as you don't sell, you don't have to pay taxes.
Yeah, exactly. We're quickly running out of time. If there's anybody who has any questions, we would be happy to take them.
I do think that somebody wrote an interesting question here. They said, do you worry about these leaks affecting the ability of tax researchers to work with tax agencies? I think I would actually broaden that question is like, do these leaks make it more difficult to administer the tax code in general? So if you're an IRS employee and you're having all these leaks, it's going to be more difficult to access data. You're going to have to get more permissions to access different forms or different types of entities. And so these restrictions are going to get tougher at the IRS. And then also for academic researchers, I mean, this is a thing, right? They don't know where, you know, we talked specifically about it, but the ProPublica leaks, we're not sure where that came from. And there's some concern it was from academics, and they're like tightening the screws on academics accessing IRS data as a result. So,
yeah, so maybe just so people know, Jeff at one point has been, has had like an employee type relationship with the IRS, which allows him to access data under certain circumstances and use that for academic studies. And in fact, Jeff and I together have written a paper which used that data, although Jeff at that point wasn't the one that used the data. It was our third co-author, Jaron Wild. But in any case, what's interesting about that is when Jaron had that data, like I never could even see the data because it's very tightly controlled, but Jaron could. And Jaron could see what was happening, and Jeff has at certain points in his career been able to see certain types of data that the IRS has. And if one has access to that data, then one might possibly leak the data. And if they discover that this is happening because their data is in the hands of too many people, that could be damaging for all kinds of public policy research, which we need in order to make more efficient legislation that's sort of informed by data. And if researchers don't have access to that data, that's bad for everyone. So there could be negative externalities that arise from these leaks, which I think sometimes we don't think about. I think certainly the reporters don't always think about those negative externalities, and that's something that I think is serious and real.
They might think about it, but I think it is an interesting trade-off of, on the one hand, like the journalists are just providing us some interesting anecdotes, and the academic researchers are going to like provide us with broad-based population level, actual real analysis that you can make real decisions on. And trading one of those off for the other, I'm not sure is a good policy choice, but
yeah. All right, I think that's pretty much it. Let me just comment. Some of you may have tuned in with the great expectation of learning how Salesforce managed to not pay taxes on a couple $1 billion of income. I will certainly cover that in a future chat. I'm not sure if it'll be next week or the week after. We got to see what's going on in the news right now. The Salesforce. So let me just give you a little background there. Almost every year, various watchdog organizations will release a list of 30 or 40 companies that are big and prominent that didn't pay tax on their income. And in many of those cases, if one understands the way corporate taxes work, one can go into the financial statement footnotes and uncover the major drivers of the ability to pay no tax. And Salesforce is one that I've looked at. Salesforce is a company that I find interesting to think about because the CEO of Salesforce has pushed quite forcefully on the need for companies to operate with a goal of sort of societal benefit in mind, which at some level seems a little bit at odds with the situation where you might pay no taxes, which, given that taxes are often used for society's benefit. So I have looked into Salesforce, and I think I know what's going on with that particular company. There are others that I also know, but we'll definitely put that on the schedule, if maybe next week or the week after, assuming that something interesting like the Pandora paper leak doesn't come about. So keep an eye on your emails if you're interested. Also, if you have not sent in your name for the email subscription, please feel free to do that. Share it with other people, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future. And if you think you know someone who might be interested in this, we'll take this recording and post it out on YouTube, and you can catch it there. And eventually, we're going to try to suck the audio out of these and create some form of a podcast. So great to be with you, and thanks for chiming in and for your great questions. We'll talk to you next week.